Today, in our continued Lenten explorations of grief and goodness intertwined, and our continued journey toward Jerusalem with Jesus, we catch up with Jesus as he enters Jericho. And as I previewed with our young disciples moments ago, Luke will reveal to us that there in Jericho, a crowd meets Jesus, a crowd so large that it would prevent some from seeing Jesus. And so, as we will hear, a man named Zacchaeus gets creative, and his creativity leads to a life-changing encounter. So let us listen carefully as Charlie reads for us Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10, that we all may hear the fullness of the wisdom God has for us this morning.
Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay them back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost."
May God add understanding to this reading of God's holy word. Please pause for a moment of prayer with me. O Holy One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So, our Lenten series, sharing conversations about grief and goodness intertwined, continues today with reflections from our very own Will Beachey. And as I thought about Will's reflections in conversation with the story of Zacchaeus' life-changing encounter with Jesus, I was reminded that God's transformative presence and love sometimes become most tangible to us in the times that we least expect. As will share momentarily, sometimes in moments of deep loss, we sense God's love in ways we've never imagined, and we are forever changed. Or as Zacchaeus experienced, sometimes Jesus, God with us, calls our name when we are only stretching to see something out of curiosity, and suddenly we see the world and our place in it very differently. God has a way of doing that again and again, finding us in the midst of grief and loss and struggle and calling out from these moments goodness and love to nurture us in God's dreams for the future. God does not wish the pain and loss and struggle upon us, but God does continually cultivate renewal and new life in all the desert places of our lives. And that is good news this Lent and always. And just as Jesus called Zacchaeus' name, inviting him into life-changing encounter with God's love among us, we should remember that God invites us into life-changing encounter with God's great love for us. God is with us. God is in the struggle, in Lent and always. So with that in mind, with those few words of preview, let us now listen as the Spirit of God speaks through Will's reflections of grief and goodness intertwined. Will, thank you for joining in our Continuing series on grief and goodness intertwined. Can you start by sharing with us an experience of grief that you have had in your life?
The death of my father was the one that I was thinking of mostly. Just a little background. I grew up in central Illinois on a farm. Dad was a strict disciplinarian. He had, 6 kids, small farm, and I'm sure he was stressed out. I knew he loved us, but it was mixed in with that strictness. I can appreciate that much more in retrospect. I had a lot of anger at that time, as a kid growing up. But that changed, when I left home and went to college and got married and so on. I sensed then that, things were a lot different, and he was more open with us. Anyway, the time came, he had cancer. It kept spreading and metastasizing, and it finally got to the point where he had had enough of hospitals, and he just didn't want to go through that. And we kind of made it clear to him that, it's his choice. I talked to him about hospice care. We took turns with the hospice care, spending time helping Mom take care of things. All of a sudden, we realized Dad was going downhill very quickly. That entailed kind of a big trip for me. We lived in Bismarck, North Dakota. And so I took off for Arthur, Illinois one day, really realizing that things were very urgent. Dad was on the brink of death. It wasn't just that he was getting worse, he was dying. Got there just in time in the evening when Dad was in his hospital bed, but he wasn't very cognizant. It was at the same time, it was kind of a terrifying thing, kind of a horrible thing, but yet some of my other siblings were there, Mom was there, and it was kind of a holy event. In early morning, I heard all this commotion upstairs. I was in the basement sleeping on a cot down there and rushed upstairs, and just at that time, Dad had died. It was kind of surprising. It wasn't a horrible thing. It wasn't terrifying. It was more of an awesome, privileged event. I felt privileged to be there. I just felt this awful sense of loss. I felt this sorrow and longing, this deep longing, and also I felt this love. This love I felt. I wondered, maybe that was the same thing as loving God. How else would I love God? This mysterious abstract thing, but it's in loving people, I think.
It sounds like that was very much a thin place of sorts, to borrow the terminology that some Celtic Christianity traditions do. The veil between the beyond and the present was very thin there as your dad transitioned into eternal care.
I like that term too, that thin place, that you almost can see into the other side there. My sister was telling me, she was there before I was, and she was saying that Dad was speaking. He was saying, they said I could go now. And Rosie, my sister Rosie, said, what do you mean? Who said what? Do you mean heaven? And he says, yes. And he said, I could see Emery, that was his brother who had died before him. I think something mysterious was going on there. Arthur, Illinois is a rather large Amish community. And that's part of my identity, actually. My parents were Amish when they were married. And in fact, they were still Amish when I was born. And then they joined the Mennonite church after that. That was a tough thing for Dad to do, to leave the Amish church, because, his dad lived right there. But his dad was very gracious, and love overcame. And I always knew my Amish grandpa, as being a very kind, gentle man. And Dad had good relationships with the Amish people there. But I didn't realize how much of an impact his life had made on the Amish we had the funeral at the Mennonite church. We had a visitation the day before the funeral. And so we were all there in the church sanctuary, and the Amish people just poured in there. It's just amazing, coming up there with their horses and buggies and coming in and coming up to the family, shaking our hands. And they didn't leave. They just filled up that sanctuary with just sitting there, quietly sitting there. That's kind of what they do with the Amish wakes. They're just there. They're just present. It was just an expression of support and their love, I think. I realized they wouldn't be doing that if Dad didn't have some very positive impact on their lives. Absent Dad, I don't think they would have experienced that love that they obviously experienced from Dad. And so there again, it kind of struck me in retrospect that that's how God must love us, is through people. I mean, I didn't know my dad had that positive impact on people. His stature increased greatly after his death somehow. A challenge to me, be more like Dad. I knew Dad as a person who didn't talk about other people. He didn't talk disparagingly about other people at all. Something that I sometimes am guilty of. And so it was a challenge to me to be gracious and withhold judgment. I used to think Dad was kind of a pushover, that people could just kind of run over him. Amish people don't drive cars, and they would come around the house all hours of the day and night and want to use the telephone. That's kind of a curious thing. And the Amish don't have telephones, but they could use someone's telephone. That was okay. And so anytime, growing up, and someone could be knocking on the door, someone wanted to come in and call the veterinarian or whatever. And then also to be hauled around, they don't have cars, but if they needed to go to a doctor's appointment or whatever, Dad would take them. But when they built a new house, our folks did, and then they had the telephone out in the garage specifically for the Amish people. They just wanted to keep that sense of community with the Amish, I guess. So that was a lesson to me, I think, that, just to be gracious and not cling to things as this is mine. Dad was always willing to just let anybody borrow anything.
They very much, it sounds like, built a bridge for the Amish neighbors that they had, when many others probably would have made different choices. They chose hospitality, which is a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, yeah.